Treasure seeking, looking for rich and beautiful things buried in the ground, was one of the roots of archaeology. And archaeology's greatest treasure was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, in the Valley of the Kings. But treasure has many different faces. The public story, the excavation of Tut's tomb, is a boy's own tale about a man with a dream and a shovel, digging up some steps and hitting the jackpot. "Can you see anything?" said Lord Carnarvon. "Yes," Howard Carter replied. "Wonderful things." You know, there's a real surprise for people when they come into the tomb of Tutankhamun. It's a strange thing. They think they're coming to see King Solomon's mines, the place where the treasure came from, stacks of gold. They file into the tomb, they look around and they look at that mask. What they see is a portrait of an 18-year-old young man valiantly staring into eternity. It's a strange thing. Lots of people leave here very moved by it. The whole tomb is strange, really. You're not sure whether you're in a place of archaeology or treasure seeking. It's very weird. The opening of Tut's tomb released an ancient magic, a fascination into the modern world. Millions come to the Cairo Museum to see his treasures. And it's not surprising. The best craftsmen of ancient Egypt spent their lives making these extraordinary things. They provide their visitors with an immediate contact to the distant past. The treasure chambers of the lords of Europe were the dark side of a golden public face, a ceremonial of court and culture, symbol and superstition that stretched back to the emperors of ancient Rome. These princes store the alchemy of ancient treasure in small and secret rooms. And the first people to be called archaeologists were the guardians of these things. It's great, isn't it? You know what this is? It's the ancestor of every modern museum in the world. It's the treasure chamber of a prince in a medieval castle just outside Innsbruck, Schloss Amras it's called. There used to be lots of these in Europe. The princes used to like to collect all these weird and wonderful objects like magpies from all over the world and stuff them into a little room where they could go and look and wonder at the magic of the world. It was really a source of power for the princes themselves because they saw the past not in terms of archaeology, not in terms of science, but as a place of mystery and magic, and they wanted in their castles, between their armories and their treasuries, some of this strange alchemy from the past. You know, of all the objects in this treasure chamber, the things that held most real power to the princes that made the collections were images of ancient Rome. Rome, after all, was the centre of their universe. These pictures of Roman emperors represented an empire, a kingdom beyond their wildest dreams 1,000 years and more ago. At Rome herself, the ruins of the ancient city, palaces and temples half hidden in the ground, seemed to be filled with magic treasures. A collector's dream. Marble statues, one old writer says, like people petrified by walking in the moonlight. So seductive were these ancient figures that artists copied their poses and proportions. Mars became a saint, Venus the Virgin Mary. By the 17th century, treasure-seeking northerners were digging up the Roman ruins and carting off their contents, taking culture and the sorcery of ancient treasure to the north. This was modern archaeology's beginnings, and the start of the European antiquities trade as well. By the 18th century, the northern taste for southern treasure was so developed that the rich were building private galleries to hold their souvenirs of Italy. Archaeology had bred connoisseurship, a love of the antique. Artists have known about this lady for centuries. There are several Roman statues exactly in the same pose. It's the pose that inspired Botticelli's Birth of Venus. The Brits, though, weren't interested in its artistic qualities in that sense. Look at her closely, and you'll find that she's very heavily restored. She's got a new nose, 2 new arms, new legs and ankles. In other words, she's been turned from an antiquity back into a living woman, and the British were in love. One tourist, Mr. Richardson, when he first went and saw this in Florence, was transfixed on the spot for 12 hours. Byron wrote stanzas about this lady, trying to express, as he said, the inexpressible. Mr. Smollett, a very garrulous old Brit, actually didn't like her very much, but he found her rear parts very happy. Mr. Spence, though, well, he admired her breasts. He thought they were small, firm and delicate. German connoisseur Herr Winkelmann, however, expressed the opinion that perhaps her navel was a trifle deep. In actual fact, the German connoisseurs really knew what was going on here. One of them wrote home, "The British are here in Rome and buying everything. Thank God they haven't got an eye for sculpture." Mr. William Weddell of Newby Hall carried his beautiful Venus off to Yorkshire in 1766. In the language of his time, he and his friends were impassioned archaeologists. In the same years that Mr. Weddell went to Rome to study Venus, 2 English gentlemen turned up here to draw the temples on the Acropolis of Athens, to take something of the magic wisdom of the ancient Greeks back to the cold north. James Stewart and Nicholas Revitt published several large volumes of the Antiquities of Greece, the land, so the ancient Romans said, from which all art and beauty came. Stewart and Revitt didn't draw picturesque landscapes filled with nymphs and shepherds like most of their contemporaries. But the first archaeological survey of the Acropolis of Athens, drawings as precise as engineering plans, with reconstructions of the ancient architecture revealing every member in its perfection. They caused a revolution in world taste. That neoclassic movement that spread out around the world, you can see today in the Washington Monument, Euston Station, all over the place. The proportions, the exactitude of it all is still with us today. It's the beginning of the modern archaeological study of ancient monuments. The first time, too, that ruins were seen as belonging to archaeological periods and styles. Unfortunately, these same splendid publications also served as shopping lists. And of course, it wouldn't be long before people didn't come here to take measurements, but to take buildings, to take statues, to take the whole lot away. That third lady along there is made of concrete. The original is in a gallery in London, and they say if you go in there at night, you can hear her crying for Athens. She was taken by the greatest plunderer of them all, Lord Elgin. In the year 1800, Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to Turkey, sent artists and workmen to Athens to take the celebrated marble sculptures of the Acropolis back to England, a part of Britain's enduring love affair with ancient marble treasure. Along with everybody else in Athens, the Turkish Distar, the town governor, was horrified, but he couldn't stop the powerful diplomat. Elgin and his wife turned up here when work was well underway. An amazing sight greeted Lady Elgin when she came round the corner. Something, she said, she never forgot as long as she lived. What she saw that day was a huge wooden scaffold with workmen swarming all over it. They were removing a row of sculptures, but first, to get them free, they had to take part of the temple's marble cornice off. There was a row of guys on the top of the temple, on top of the scaffold, with great steel wedges and mallets, and they were whacking at the cornice to dislodge it, to bring it to the ground. And when they did, it came down with a huge crash, such a crash that the poor old Distar, who lived in the house over there, was just lighting his pipe, came out sucking urgently on his pipe, could not believe his eyes. Tears ran down his face, and he said, telos, the end. After the cornice had smashed onto the temple steps, they put ropes around the sculptures, and one by one, they were lowered to the ground, put in wooden crates, and sent off to the dockyard of Piraeus for shipment to England. The archaeological treasure hunt, the innocent passions of Mr. Weddell and his friends, had turned into an international rape. Just as the British were looking towards the east, so were the French. In 1798, a very young 26-year-old revolutionary general called Napoleon Bonaparte set sail for Egypt from France. He had 400 ships, 35,000 men, and 1,000 pieces of artillery. His private dreams was to colonize the entire Mediterranean, to turn it into a French sea. Publicly, he announced to the Egyptians he was bringing them liberty, equality, and fraternity, and he was going to rid them forever of these cruel medieval rulers, a band of knights called the Mamluks. Along with the army invading Egypt, Napoleon had groups of French artists, scientists and engineers to record the ancient land and to keep an eye open for those ancient treasures for which Egypt was so famous. On their march to Cairo, Egyptology was born. I've just drawn the River Nile. Cairo is here. Now, as soon as the French, who had been marching all day and were pretty exhausted, saw Cairo and passed the pyramids, they set themselves into 5 great regimental squares. French firepower, bang, 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 bang. The Mamluks, who have been swanning around in their beautiful silk and cashmere uniforms, their huge guns, their great sabres, now got on their horses and charged the French. What happened, of course, was a slaughter, a massacre. 2,000 Mamluks were killed, 29 French died. They said the bodies of the Mamluks and their horses were piled around each one of these squares. Their silks and cashmeres were burning from the gun cotton from the muskets. It was a terrible and frightening sight. So the French entered the city that day, strutted about in the streets. But there was another exchange too, a rather gentler and more profound one perhaps. When the French came to Cairo, there were shops selling coffee, or café as it was then called. But they were selling it not by packets in shops, but the shops had little stalls in the street, and they were making the coffee and bringing it out onto the pavements, and people would sit and talk and drink their coffee. And on that day, the boulevard was born. Within a few weeks, the first Institute of Archaeology in Egypt came into being.
Napoleon's officers took over the houses of the Mamluks, the defeated soldiers who ran south into Egypt. These beautiful dwelling houses were now lived in by the French. These were the people who were going to set the government up for Egypt. They were divided into 4 separate divisions in a Grande French Academy. There was the political economists, generals, senior scholars from France who were going to run the country. Then there were 3 other divisions that were looking at everything else in Egypt. There were physicists, inventors, botanists, zoologists, surgeons. There were artists, poets, writers, musicians. And it was these people, the surveys that they did here, that was really the beginning of Egyptology. It was a contact between the new revolutionary France of the West and the oldest civilization that they knew on Earth.
After the Battle of the Pyramids, the French army split in half. Napoleon struck north into Syria and sent General Desai marching south into Upper Egypt, pursuing Mamluks. It was very hard work chasing what was left of the Mamluk army into Upper Egypt. And everywhere they went, the French soldiers had to put down endless rebellions. And they were short of everything, from bread to bullets. It was really a terrifyingly hard march. But suddenly, when these ragged and diseased regiments of men, very low morale and very short on temper, came to Thebes and saw the temples, so one diarist remarks, they stood with one accord and looked in amazement, and then clapped their hands with delight. It was as if at that moment they had conquered Egypt, they said. You know, at that moment too, Europe knew hardly anything of these remains. Just a few travellers had been here, not much. The French were going to change all that. A year later, they wrote an inscription down there on the pylon, listing all the major temples of Upper Egypt and their latitude and longitude. And then the Academy of Sciences and Arts went out and started to measure and draw these monuments for the first time and show them to the West. And the West has been fascinated with them ever since.
Là encore, il y a eu un temple qui a été construit encore. C'est un temple référent à la
Even Napoleon's generals, usually drunk on war and glory, were as fascinated with ancient Egypt as the scholars. Their records of the army marching into Upper Egypt, in reality a daily horror story, read like a journey to a magic world. A journey whose archaeological record was in the printed pages of the Description d'Egypte, those grand volumes that Napoleon's scholars published on their return to France, one of the greatest and certainly one of the largest publications in the world.
Now, look, this isn't just a normal archaeological expedition. These are not guys in well-equipped suits flying in aeroplanes. These are people in rags, with ophthalmia, with pus in their eyes. They're making their pencils by beating out bullets, but they're making such wonderful drawings.
Of all Egyptian monuments, the French's favourite was the mortuary temple of King Ramesses II, called the Ramesseum. Its yellowed walls seem like a living painting by Claude or Poussin. This vast colossus was mostly buried in those days. 60 feet high, weighing 100 tons, it had been toppled and broken in an ancient earthquake. The French archaeologists excavated and drew the statue, and the expedition sculptor, Castex, carved all their names upon the top of Pharaoh's head. The statue quickly became a European legend, especially after Percy Shelley used its image in a poem.
I met a traveller from an antique land who said, Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Shelley had actually based his wonderful poem on a less fortunate effort by one Horace Smith, a city stockbroker, who'd penned a volume with the most unfortunate title of Rejected Addresses. The first line goes something like this: In Egypt's sandy silence all alone stands a gigantic leg.
At this point, you may have gathered that the beautiful Ramesseum temple had become a part of a very British dream. After sinking the French fleet in a daring sea battle, Nelson's navy had completely isolated the French in Egypt. Slowly, over a period of 3 years, both the soldiers and the scholars trickled back to France. In Egypt, they were followed by a British expeditionary force and a host of collectors ready to strip the antique land. Now, the greatest of these collectors was the man who wrote his name up there, Belzoni, Giovanni Battista Belzoni. He was an engineer from Padua, a great giant of a man, a friendly person, a person of great character, and he stamped his name on really this early period of Egyptian archaeology. Belzoni actually set his house up in here, along with his wife Sarah and their servant, as an Irish guy, long-suffering lad called James. He'd been sent down here to look for a statue which had sort of been given conveniently to the British nation. Belzoni had come to collect it and take it back to England. So he came down here with his wife and they looked around and he found it under a heap of sand, and as he says in his bestseller, smiling gently at the thought of coming to England. Belzoni made a wooden frame to hold the smiling statue. Then he and his men engaged in a month-long purgatory of pushing and pulling to get it to the riverside. To London's great delight, 17 months later, the Royal Engineers installed young Memnon in the British Museum. It was the start of a long career of excavation and treasure seeking for Belzoni. Amongst hordes of other treasure seekers, mostly agents of European consuls, his name stands out as the first famous archaeologist of ancient Egypt. Well bitten by the antiquities bug, Belzoni and the British consul decided to continue their hunt for treasure and antiquity in the hills behind the Ramesseum, in the Valley of the Kings. Belzoni describes walking through this same valley in August 1817. Hasn't changed much. He later wrote, I happened to be carrying a stick with me at the time, and on thrusting it into a hole in a rock, I found one to be very deep. He'd found his first royal tomb, and others quickly followed, some of them with fine sarcophagi, and all of them unknown. This was his first really beautiful monument that he found here. It's the tomb of a late Ramesside prince, a warrior prince, called Montu Hekobeshev. Belzoni was absolutely entranced by this tomb. He said it gave a clever and perfect idea of Egyptian art. And he was right too. This is still one of the very greatest of ancient Egyptian tombs we have. And it's pretty near perfect too. And that's one of the wonderful things about Belzoni, because although he's usually portrayed as this dire old treasure hunter who goes around bashing things up, He didn't cut all the faces out like the Napoleonic scholars had done when they came to the Valley of the Kings, and like much more famous Egyptologists would do 10 years after Belzoni had left it. He left these monuments in situ, absolutely perfect as he found them. However, he still had to make a profit. The British consul wanted goodies to flog, and Belzoni wanted something for his own credit. He was beginning to realise that he could become a famous explorer with a grand reputation. Now he knew, because ancient Greek tourists had told him so in their writings, that there were 40 tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Belzoni, though, could only count 20. So he knew that there were piles of treasure in this desert, just waiting to be found. Belzoni was a quick and practical man, much more practical than most archaeologists who've ever worked here. And he'd been able to read this landscape like a book. What to most people today just seems general sort of mounds and chaos in the desert, to him would have told him what was going on under the ground. These are chippings. Look, every one of them has got a chisel mark where an ancient quarryman has whacked it off the wall. Now look at this mound behind me. That is not a natural mound. That is a mound of chippings. These bits of very soft shale embedded with the limestone would have told him that this had been quarried very deep down in the ground where that shale was. He'd have seen it further down the valley, exposed, so he knew exactly where this was occurring in the landscape. There were other indications too. When it rains in this valley, as it does every now and again, the water rushes down here, runs into the centre of the valley and goes down the road. Belzoni, though, noticed that in this part of the valley, some of the water was sinking straight into the ground. That, then, was where the tombs were. So with the consul's money, he started to dig a great sway through the landscape, and they came across 2 or 3 really beautiful tombs, full of paintings, nice collection of antiquities. Not the jackpot, but pretty good stuff. Then one day, the greatest day of his life, says Belzoni, he found the tomb that would become the most famous monument in all of Egypt. The king's name was on the door, Seti I, who'd ruled Egypt in the 13th century BC. In Belzoni's day, though, no one knew that because no one could read the hieroglyphs. Belzoni's enormous tomb, though, was immediately famous and much visited. Its pictures just as Belzoni drew them, precise, slightly pinched and brightly coloured, greatly to 19th century taste. What, though, to do with yet another immovable treasure? Belzoni had an inspiration. He made casts of the tomb and in 1821 reconstructed parts of it in a Piccadilly gallery in London and sold tickets to the show. It was a sensation, the documentary of its day, and Belzoni's accompanying book, an international bestseller. The Italian engineer had realised what it would take most other treasure seekers another century to understand. The treasures of Egypt were as much in the imagination as in the sand. A year after Belzoni's London exhibition, a Frenchman, Francois Champollion, announced that after years of study, he had deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. It was the first ancient language to be deciphered in modern times. And suddenly, the treasures of old Egypt were in worse danger than they had ever been before. After Champollion, ancient Egypt was no longer a romantic dream, but an academic industry. Year by year, multitudes of texts on old papyri and the ancient monuments were all deciphered and undone. Flocks of Western scholars gave Egypt's tombs and temples names and dates and stories of their own. In In 1843, Herr Dr. Professor Richard Lepsius of Berlin came to Egypt with a royal expedition to make a sort of Prussian version of the Description d'Egypte. Lepsius was one of the very greatest of all Egyptologists. Now just think of it. The great man comes here just 15 years after the decipherment of hieroglyphics. The Frenchman who worked on the Description knew nothing of what they were writing down on those sheets of paper. Lepsius could read the names. He could see the name of Ramesses under a head. That made the head worth 100 times more than if it said Fred Bloggs. It suddenly became a collector's dream. Everything had labels on it.
These are the mighty stones that cover the burial chamber entrance of the Great Pyramid. And carved upon them is a glorious hieroglyphic inscription in honor of the King of Prussia's birthday.
Designed by Lepsius himself. And it goes on with Prussian eagles and iron crosses, the whole lot. It lists all the artists, the architects and the director of the expedition, and it honors the king in titles that a pharaoh would be proud of. This guy isn't ruler of the Nile, he's ruler of the Rhine. It's a wonderful metaphor for the way that modern Europe was moving in on ancient Egypt, taking over its history and taking its treasures too. Lepsius shipped 60 barge loads of them out. Not just innocently gathered heaps of treasure either, but the most careful, the most scholarly selection of art and architecture sampled from the most famous temples and tombs of every epoch of ancient Egypt's history. Other nations, too, were building similarly vast collections. The slow trade of Belzoni and the consuls was threatening to turn into an international feeding frenzy. You know, the villagers that live round here in Karnak, outside the temple walls, call this place here the Ard Marsud. It means the enchanted land. It's almost as if through 3 changes of religion, 2,000 years, they'd kept a memory of what this great building once contained, when its walls were plated with gold and its doors shone with bronze, and there were ingots stacked in the treasury and golden vases and treasures beyond belief. The old villagers used to say that once a year, a magic golden boat sailed on the sacred lake, and it was piled with gold and silver and precious stones, and that all you had to do was to walk onto the boat and you could take everything you wanted, with one condition: you weren't allowed to speak. Now this was very difficult for the local people because they like to speak a lot, and anyway, when they find a treasure they have to thank their God, so not one person had ever managed to get on and off that boat with a panful of gold. But there was somebody who did it, they said. It was a Frenchman, a classic 19th century adventurer called Auguste Mariette. And being a good Frenchman, he kept his mouth truly shut. He went on that boat and he grabbed all the treasure he could. And that's how the jewels got into the Cairo Museum. Like many others of his day, Mariette had first travelled to Egypt to collect treasures for a European museum. Unlike the others, he stayed for the rest of his life. A schoolteacher from the Channel port of Boulogne, Mariette began his work in Egypt in the cemeteries that stand in the shadows of the pyramids of Saqqara. Mariette dug up hundreds of tombs like this, all over Saqqara, and he found thousands of statues in them too. Some of the greatest ancient Egyptian statues the world has ever seen came out of this sand. He wasn't a very brilliant archaeologist. He sometimes let his work gangs go on for months when he wasn't here, completely unattended, and then they'd lay the sculptures at his feet when he came back, and boy did he like those images. He really liked them. It's a funny thing, this desert, you know. It just looks like heaps of sand lying around the place. I'm sure the tourists that come here just think it's the Lawrence of Arabia effect. But it's far more than that. This is the cemetery of ancient Egypt's largest city. There are thousands upon thousands of tombs here, most of them ruined, buried under the flooding, drifting sands. And they've been plundered for thousands of years too. Ancient Greeks came here with flour sieves to sieve out gold beads from the mummies. Generations upon generations of travellers came here and went home with mementos. But it took Mariette and his work gangs to systematically clear the greater part of it. Mariette knew this landscape. He could tell what was natural and what wasn't natural. These are decaying limestone blocks. And this would have told Mariette that somebody had built a tomb here. This too is an obvious giveaway. You see these great black bands running down here. This is mud brick. Mariette would have seen then that he had limestone walls and mud brick walls. This had been quite a complex of enclosures made of different periods, different ages. Anyway, one day Mariette was out for a walk, wondering what had happened to his men. Just as he gets to the tomb, all of a sudden, the men rush out the door of the tomb, shouting, "Shekel Beled, Shekel Beled!" Mariette must have been fairly amused at this. See, Shekel Beled means the headman of our village. What the hell was the headman of the village doing in the tomb? So he went in. And you can imagine, it must look much like this place. Funny sort of shafts in the sand, all the abandoned tools. And there he found the most extraordinary sight, because the men were taking down part of a mud brick wall, like that one there. And suddenly, just as they opened the bricks, the sunlight flashed on a statue. Now, this statue was made of wood, but its eyes were pure crystal. And for a second, the men had thought it was a person. It looked, in fact, just like the headman of their village, as if he'd been entombed for eternity. It was one of Mariette's greatest discoveries. The statue is now very famous and in the Cairo Museum. But he'd also seen something else. What he'd seen was that the people he was working with, the actual Egyptian labourers, were relating to the things he was finding absolutely intimately. The real marvels that Mariette dug up at Saqqara were not so easily carried off, though. The greatest tombs of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, made in the 3rd millennium BC.
That's the owner of the tomb, Ptah-Hotep, vizier of the 5th dynasty of King Assisi, and a very rich man, rich enough to build this wonderful tomb. And look, over here, here's the artist of this miraculous wall. He's just finished his work, and he's drinking a huge pot of beer, and he's going to eat that big plate of figs. That should do him good. Do you know, some of these hieroglyphs here are so perfect that archaeologists now use them as perfect examples when they write hieroglyphs. This is the best. Up here is a father and son making a rope. And the father is saying to the son, look, in hieroglyphs up there, bring me some more material. And he's saying, oh yes, my father. You know, when Mariette saw this tomb, these sort of explanations, which are the explanations that guides give you, weren't available, of course. So where would he have understood all this? Well, he got it actually from the land of Egypt itself. And the more of these monuments he uncovered, the more he realised that they came from Egypt and were a part of this landscape, and that these old stones shouldn't really be shipped off to cold countries where they had no special meaning.
Encouraged by French businessmen and diplomats, Egypt's ruler, Said Pasha, appointed Mariette to conserve the ancient monuments and form Egypt's own museum of antiquities. The first thing that Mariette did was to stop all excavations but his own. And with that one command, he saved ancient Egypt from the European treasure seekers. It was near miraculous that one of the very few foreigners of the day who loved and appreciated old Egypt should ever have been given such a job. When he was placed in charge of the monuments of Egypt, Mariette spent months each year on a boat like this, drifting slowly down the Nile from Aswan to Cairo. These boats were called dahabiyas, golden ones. Europeans had travelled on them since they started to come to Egypt in the century before Mariette. You could say Mariette found his greatest treasure on a dahabiya. It's an odd yarn. He was drifting along one day, going to Thebes to collect some jewellery that somebody had dug up for him, and he noticed another boat going in the opposite direction. It was full of a local potentate and the women of his harem, and as he went past, Mariette noticed that the women were wearing ancient Egyptian jewellery. His jewellery, he thought. So he took off in pursuit, stormed the harem and took back the jewellery. Today it's one of the greatest treasures of the Cairo Museum. Mariette arrived at a rather good solution for all those people that wanted lumps of ancient Egypt. He went into the temples and tombs and made little sketches of the jewellery and vases drawn on their walls. Then he had the fakers of Cairo and Luxor make them up in gold and fine stone. These were then dished out as presents from Mariette's own excavations. It's a fact, you know, that in many of the world's great museums, some of Mariette's fakes are still exhibited as great treasures of ancient Egypt. He also restored ancient Egypt herself. Most of the great temples we visit today were dug out by Mariette in enormous excavations, huge gangs of peasants often working as forced labour, excavating all over Egypt. Before Mariette, most of these grand temples were half buried, with villages built all around them. Dendera, in the fields of Upper Egypt, he exposed an ancient marvel, a perfect temple with scenes and texts that described a yearly calendar of intricate ceremonial.
You know, when Mariette and his merry men turned up to dig this temple out, it was full up with earth to about 8 or 9 feet at the tops of those columns there. The black on the ceiling is from cooking fires. People were living under here. He dug the temples up to save them, not just for Egyptology. He said he did it against the greed of the peasants and the covetousness of the Europeans. Got to think, when he started this work, Karnak was still being partly demolished for its stone. Other temples had already gone. This one could well have been next. By simply digging it out, he showed to the world what marvels, what wonders were in the temple.
How many tourists today realise that the past they see in Egypt is largely the past as presented by Auguste Mariette? This isn't just ancient Egypt here, but reconstructed ancient Egypt, plus Aida. For Verdi's opera was also set inside Mariette's vision of the past. It even helped to write Aida's script. Mariette presents Ancient Egypt, a European tradition that with tact and passion, French diplomacy has preserved from Napoleon down till today. Mariette's present successor in the great temple of Karnak, that same temple that caused those starving French soldiers to clap and cheer 2 centuries ago, is Francois Larcher. He's continuing the work of his predecessor, Henri Chevrier, who resurrected entire temples from the buried ruins, making brand new ancient treasures, real archaeology. Why do you want to open the open-air museum, apart from showing people beautiful things, of course?
It has, for us, it has 3 aims to rebuild this monument in the open-air museum. The more evident one is to show the visitors unknown walls and beautiful carving. The second one is to protect these blocks from destruction. If these blocks were kept on the ground as they were before, very quickly the water by capillarity will come up from the water table inside the stones, and very quickly the salts will appear on the stones and they will be decaying very quickly. And the third one, which is for us more important, is to understand fully the architectures of these buildings. We can only discover the details of the architecture in rebuilding these buildings. When I work here, I really feel that we are in the same line as Mariette and Maspero, and especially Legrain and Chevrier in Karnak. We do exactly the same work. We have different technical means, but we nearly do the same work that they have done.
When are you going to finish in Karnak?
Or it will be never finished. For myself, it will finish one day, but I will have, I hope, many successors.
Mariette died of diabetes at the age of 60 in 1881. He's not thought much of by archaeologists today, yet the truth is he was one of the greatest of them all. Firstly, he stopped the plunder of Egypt. Secondly, he introduced a system of conserving and guarding monuments. It was the first in the Middle East, and after France, the second in the whole world. It's said that when he lay dying in his house in Cairo, in a delirium, the last thing he thought of was a vision of a great museum. 20 years after he died, it was made a reality. And his collections, along with Mariette's own tomb, were moved into this splendid monument, now one of the great treasure houses of the world.
The famous Cairo Museum. The strange thing is that after Mariette, archaeologists rather gave up on art and treasure. In today's profession, the glittering prizes are ideas, not gold. Ideas that take you up the academic ladder of success. So gold, like Tutankhamun's, is considered rather vulgar. Millions, though, still come to Cairo. They see these ancient dreams of wonder, so carefully made, so very long ago. Perhaps they're seeing something the academics have forgotten. The face of a quiet young man smiling at us from an alien eternity. And in that simple contact is perhaps the greatest treasure of them all.